The Wild West, a time when there were few rules and the United States grew quickly, was a time when punishments were often harsh and quick. Settlers tried to bring order to a wild frontier, which led to punishments that were both a mirror of the harsh environment and a demonstration of how creative people could be. We'll dive into some of the harshest punishments that were used during those rough times. Hanging. Hanging was one of the most common and well-known ways to punish people in the Wild West, and it left a dark mark on the whole time period. The way people were hanged in the Wild West was different from other places and times, giving it a new level of seriousness. Because the border was so big, law enforcement had to work with few people. This often meant that justice was done quickly and sometimes too quickly. People from all over the community would gather at public hangings, sometimes out of a sense of justice, and sometimes out of grave interest. Usually the gallows were put up in the middle of town or a well-known public place so that everyone could see them. The goal was to scare people away from breaking the law by showing them in public what would happen if they did. At times, it felt like a carnival, with food sellers and kids running around. In addition to the normal court system, militia groups also used hanging as their main way of enforcing what they saw as justice. Without official trials, these groups would catch people they thought were guilty, put them to death, and not bother with a ceremony. In the Wild West, it was hard to tell the difference between fair justice and mob rule. Hanging was a sad reminder of how difficult it can be to keep things in order and avoid falling into chaos. Flogging or whipping. The act of flogging or whipping, in which someone is severely hurt by being hit with leather or corded whips, goes back to civilizations that lived a long time before the Wild West. In the rough territory of the American frontier, however, it was one of the harshest punishments in the world. Like hangings, these punishments were done in public to show that people wanted to stop people from doing wrong and shame them. People were often whipped for crimes that were thought to be important, but not so bad that they should have been punished with death. If someone is found guilty of theft, fraud, or assault, they may be given a certain amount of lashings, which can be done all at once or over several days. Usually, the number of lashes relied on how bad the crime was, how the judge or jury felt, and sometimes how the crowd felt. But the shame was worse than the physical pain. Being whipped in public meant that you were seen as a bad person who should be ignored and looked down upon. In the close-knit towns of the frontier, life was already hard for the families of those who were punished because they were often shunned. Vigilantes, who were again not following the rules set by the government, used flogging as a form of harsh punishment. Because they were often not limited by the law, their actions could be very cruel. People today might think that lashing and whipping are very primitive, but in the Wild West, they were very real signs of how hard it was to keep the law and order in a society where the lines between what was civilized and what wasn't were always being changed. Branding. Branding started out as a way for farmers to identify their animals, but in the Wild West, it was used as a cruel punishment. People who broke the law were marked and shamed with this punishment, which left its mark not only on the body but also on the soul, reminding the person of their sins forever. The process was simple, but it was very scary. A red-hot metal brand, which was usually made to look like a certain letter or sign that showed what kind of crime it was used. Then it was quickly and without emotion pressed onto the skin of the person who had been found guilty. The hot metal would cut through the skin, causing terrible pain and leaving a scar that would never go away. Usually brands were put on places that could be seen even when the person was wearing clothes, like the hands or face. This way, the person's crime was always on show. In some places, certain symbols started to be linked to certain acts. A T might stand for a thief, while a M might stand for a killer. In places with few rules, vigilantes were free to brand people they thought were guilty, often without a trial or even strong proof. It wasn't just the pain that branding caused right away, it also had long-lasting effects on the person who was branded, both socially and psychologically. Reputation was very important in that time, and many people wanted to start over in the West. Being branded shut doors forever, making it one of the most dreadful punishments of the time. Stockades and pillories. In the middle of many Wild West towns, you could find a wooden frame called a stockade or pillory. These were tools used to shame and punish people in public that existed before the frontier, but were still used in these rough settings. These things showed that the community didn't like certain crimes and that public shame was more important than physical hurt. For the most part, a stockade was just a piece of wood with holes cut out for the head and arms. The criminal would have to stand with their hands and head locked in place, leaving them unable to move and open to public view. They would be stuck in this awkward spot for hours or even days, with only the weather and the people in the town to help them. People walking by could and often did throw bad food, mud, or even worse at the person. Kind people might offer a drink of water or some shade. Pillories, on the other hand, were slightly raised buildings where prisoners were shackled while standing, with their hands spread out and their faces visible for everyone to see and make fun of. This elevation not only made it easier to see, but it also made the situation more uncomfortable. Usually, these were used for acts that were morally wrong, but not bad enough for physical or capital punishment. People who commit adultery, fraud, or being drunk in public could get this kind of punishment. Simple things like stockades and pillories were very effective at reminding people of the moral code that they lived by. In many ways, the Wild West was lawless, but these things showed that social norms and the consequences of breaking them were still very much living on the frontier. Ear cropping and nose slitting. Ear cropping and nose slitting were two of the worst penalties in the Wild West. They were both physically and symbolically painful. These punishments came to the American frontier as harsh ways to show shame and get even with people. They were based on old traditions and had been used in many cultures around the world. A part, if not the whole, of a person's ear was cut off during cutting. A knife or other sharp blade was often used to cut off the skin, which hurt very badly right away. The effects were more than just bodily damage. The act was a sign that the person would always be a bad person. People with such a clear mark were often immediately thought to be criminals, which came with all the social problems that came with that. Slitting the nose was just as scary, if not scarier. Incisions had to be made, or even parts of the nose had to be cut off. Like having your ears cut off, the pain was instant and the scars would last a lifetime. Because the nose is in the middle of the face, it is hard to hide, which makes this punishment especially bad in social terms. In a place and time where character was everything, cutting off someone's ears or nose wasn't just about hurting them physically. It was also about marking them for life and making sure that their bad deeds would never be forgotten or forgiven. Tar and feathers. In the history of the Wild West, tarring and feathering stands out as the cruelest penalty that was never carried out by a judge. This shameful form of mob justice has its roots in medieval Europe. It was brought back to life in the Americas as a way to punish people and shame them in public. Besides the instant physical pain, the person was often then paraded around town or left in a public place, where they had to deal with the jeers, scorn, and ridicule of others. The process of getting rid of the tar was painful and often left scars or skin that wouldn't grow back. People at the time understood what the act meant, even though we might find it strange now. The tar was a reminder of the wrongs they were thought to have done, and the feathers showed that they were different and shameful. Not only was tarring and feathering done to hardened criminals, but it was also done to people who were seen as threats to the community's ideals or who went against what most people thought. It could happen to journalists who spoke out, lawmakers who weren't liked, or anyone else thought to have crossed social lines. In the Wild West, where the line between justice and payback was often fuzzy, tar and feathers were a way for communities to stand up for their beliefs and keep things in order, albeit in a very violent and memorable way. Chain gangs. Chain gangs were a very effective way to punish people and take advantage of the resources available in the vast Wild West, where infrastructure was still in its early stages and physical labor was highly valued. Chained together, these groups of criminals were made to do hard work, often in the most difficult and dangerous places. Chain gangs were a clear example of forced work. Prisoners who were chained together at the feet had to move, work, and rest at the same time. The chains that held them together did more than one thing. They kept them from escaping, made them work together, and the steady clinking of the chains reminded them that they were locked up. But the conditions these prisoners were kept in were often cruel. A lot of people got hurt, and medical help was at best minimal. The chains that held them together gave them sores and flu. Overseeing guards were not always fair in how they treated them. Many cases of violence and unfair punishment were recorded. Chain gangs may have been based on the idea of rehabilitation and community work, but things were much worse in practice. These men, and sometimes women, were stuck in a never-ending loop of hard work and being pushed down. Not only were jail walls limiting their freedom, but so were the chains that held their feet together and made them walk the harsh terrain of the Wild West. Vigilante justice. In the Wild West, where law wasn't always clear and official justice systems were still getting established, people saw wrongdoing as an immediate and often violent problem that needed to be fixed. This was called vigilante justice. Vigilantes, who saw themselves as the protectors of morals and order, worked outside the law to do what they thought was right and quick. Vigilante groups often formed in places where police were not present or were thought to not be successful. People took things into their own hands because there weren't any organized legal systems and crime rates were going up. These groups would look for, catch, and punish people they thought were thieves because they felt a duty to do so or revenge. Vigilante actions were very different, but they were always cruel and quick. Someone who is thought to have stolen horses or killed someone is often dragged from their home in the middle of the night, quickly tried by the group and then put to death, usually by hanging. Since there wasn't an official trial process, witnesses, evidence, and a defense were rare and expensive. Also, these groups sometimes got stronger and more influential, which made the authorities nervous and created a power dynamic that was dangerous to the very foundations of the new Western society. Vigilante justice, with its rough, real-time nature, captures the wild spirit of the West. It talks about how hard it is to keep order on a new frontier, how thin the line is between justice and payback, and how bad it can be to break the law yourself in a place where the rule of law is still getting established. Keel hauling. While keel hauling is usually thought of as a punishment for pirates or bad behavior in the Navy, stories of it being used on riverboats and other water-based places in the American frontier do come up from time to time. Keel hauling was one of the cruelest and scariest punishments because it was so close to death. It was meant to leave a lasting impact on both the victim and the people watching. Even though there were no railings on the bottom of riverboats in the Wild West like there are on ocean-going ships, the act was still very scary. Here, the bad penalty was made even worse by the fast currents and murky water. In addition to the instant physical pain, keel hauling caused a lot of mental trauma. Fear of not surviving, the feeling of suffocation from being dragged underwater, and the feeling of being unable to do anything to help left survivors scarred, often for life. It's important to remember, though, that keel pulling happened very rarely and mostly through stories. According to naval legend, it was first used in the Navy, and it wasn't often used in the frontier areas. Still, stories about such harsh punishments, whether they are true or made up, serve to show how chaotic and hard life was during this troubled time in American history. Just the thought of keel hauling made people scared and scared off, so it became a dark tale in the history of frontier justice. The Gauntlet. A cruel tradition with roots in many cultures took on its own unique form. In the Gauntlet, the person who was being punished had to run or walk between two lines of people who would hit, beat, or insult them as they went by. It was a physical and mental test meant to punish, shame, and scare other people away from doing the same thing. Native American groups did this rite in their own unique ways. Some tribes used it as a rite of passage for young fighters to see how strong and tough they were. But when it came to punishment, it was sometimes used for crimes that were seen as bad for the group. People who broke the law would have to run through 2 rows of their peers and take hits from rocks, punches, and sticks. As settlers moved into new areas and fought with Native Americans, they often saw or heard stories about these tribal practices. Over time, the idea of running the gauntlet started to catch on in groups of settlers. For the newcomers, it wasn't so much a rite of passage as a way to shame and punish people in public. Criminals, especially those who are thought to be rebels or spies, may have to run through a crowd of angry townspeople who will hit and insult them. During the Wild West, where keeping order was always hard, the gauntlet was created as a way to punish everyone at once. As both judge and executor, the community quickly and publicly punished those who broke the rules. This emphasized community values and the cost of breaking the rules in a land where trust and working together were often necessary for survival. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.